Our first session this afternoon is of Saints and Sinners. We have with us eminent poet and author Jeet Thayil, whose Narcopolis won the DSC Prize for South Asian Literature in 2012. Talking to him is poet, author, and dancer Tishani Doshi. Ladies and gentlemen, a big round of applause for both of them.
Welcome to the session. We're here to talk about Jeet's new book, The Book of Chocolate Saints. I thought I'd start with a little story. Some years ago, Jeet and I were walking down a street in Calcutta. And it was a marvelous street called Chetpet Street, where you could buy anything you wanted. You could buy a mop, a frock, a coffee, grounds, gripes, baby water, chocolate saint maybe. And we were walking with two other poets, and we all thought we saw Dylan Thomas climb into a yellow taxi cab. And the other thing that we were doing is we were compiling a list of words beginning with D, because it seemed to us that Calcutta demanded that. Despair, decrepit, diamante, daguerreotype, dangerously Bengali. And I'm telling you all this because in Jeet's new novel on page 370, there is a scene of the protagonist, Newton Francis Xavier, poet/artist, who is at a poetry reading in Bombay. And instead of reading a poem, he reads a list of words beginning with D. Disgust, in parenthesis, see self, diabolic, Dhammarodham, and so it goes. When I was reading this, I had a strange feeling of a kind of echo, and I thought, I wonder if Jeet had already written this when we were walking down Chitpur Street, or if he wrote it later. Is it a case of life imitating art, or the other way around? Either way, it was certainly the case of another D word, which is déjà vu. And several times while reading this marvelous book, there was a sense of recognition, a sense of familiarity, a sense of not knowing whether it's real or not, but you recognize it somehow. And so, Jeet, I am not going to ask you about fact or fiction, because I know you hate that question. And I'm not going to ask you what percentage of Dom Moraes or F.N. Souza make up your main character. I'm not going to ask you about how much blood there is in your gingerbread man, because I know that you're never going to say, and that it's your novelist's prerogative not to say. But I do want to ask you about intimacy. I want to ask you how in the hell you managed to write a 500-page novel which has the stamina of a racehorse on speed, and which goes into several perspectives, countries, time zones, and yet we have the feeling as a reader that you're sitting in a dark room with us, telling us this story in our ear. How did you do that?
Thank you so much for that question. First of all, the D list was written after, I think, that walk in Wales. And if I was the kind of author who had an acknowledgements page, I would probably acknowledge that walk. But, you know, I don't have an acknowledgements page because I've just read too many of them, and they always seem too sentimental to me. So I didn't have one in this book. About pacing, I think the problem with writing a novel that's 500 pages or, you know, longer than 500 pages is really allowing for the reader to stay interested. So you don't want to get into kind of endless digressions, although some parts of this book there are endless digressions. But I always try to keep in mind that because of the length of it, I needed to have a kind of a page-turner quality. That was always in the back of my mind. And so thank you.
But I want to ask you, I want to push you a little bit about this question of intimacy, because I think for me that was the quality of the book that stood out, the sense that I had, which I think I miss sometimes now when I read fiction, and that I was maybe surprised to find in this book, that I really felt that it was your voice speaking to me. And it's not because I know you. I think anyone who read it would feel this sense of being told a story. And in that way, I'm going to ask you about, which is not about fact and fiction, how much of you and how much is not, but just the sense of, as a writer, you know, in a way that what Flaubert said, I am Madame Bovary. When you are writing, you are all of your characters. And tell me a little bit about that process from the fact that you've very clearly taken from your life, but made these characters that stand completely on their own.
Well, I have taken from my life. In fact, a lot of the stories in the oral history section about the poets of Bombay are true stories. And I think people who were there at that time would recognize those stories. But during the writing of it, when you introduce characters into a novel, as you know, your characters, if they are at all any good, they begin to inhabit a life of their own. And then they have their own engine. And so everything begins to be placed into that kind of framework, which changes actually what actually happened. So for example, there's stories about little-known poets. There's stories about well-known poets. And the story about Nissim Ezekiel giving away money, that did happen towards the end of his experience with Alzheimer's, towards the end of his life. But it's filtered or lensed through the story of a Swiss woman who comes to India to translate this unknown Dalit poet. And so when you see that story, and it's a story that Bombay poets know about, the story of Nissim's last years, but it's filtered through this lady who's not very kind of comfortable or familiar with India, who feels like a foreigner anyway, and then when she sees this, and it's sort of the last thing that she says in her memory of Nissim, it ends up feeling like a dream. And I think, you know, about intimacy, I mean, the way to make something intimate, especially a narrative of some length, is to inhabit characters, because that's what we have in common with each other as readers and as writers, and with the people that we read about in novels. The characters that matter to us are always characters that we end up feeling as if they are friends of ours or people we love.
I wanted to encapsulate, for those of you who may not have read the book, obviously you should go and read it, but if you haven't read the book, I was trying to encapsulate, to tell you what it was about, and I found it to be a very a difficult thing to do, because it's a very capacious book. It's a book within a book, and it deals with so many things, with poetry and art, with seduction, spirituality, suffering, aging, addiction, New York, Bombay, Bangalore. I mean, displacement, suffering, I already said suffering. And so you see, it's very difficult for me to describe it, and also structurally, it has the qualities of both a jigsaw puzzle with many little pieces that fit, but also a sense of palimpsest where there is an overlaying and an overlaying. So I failed in my task, and I thought maybe, Jeet, being the writer of the book, you might have a 2-sentence, here's my book and let me flog it to you, that you might want to share.
Sure. But before I give you the pitch, you know, it's something novelists of circa Graham Greene didn't have to do. They didn't have to encapsulate their novels into one pithy sentence. I don't think, you know, Naipaul had to ever do that. None of those writers had to do it. We, of course, do, because, you know, here we are at a literary festival, and as you know, there are 92 in India today, and we need to sell ourselves accordingly. So let me put it like this. My novel is about a blocked poet and unblocked painter who hits the age of 66 and decides to throw himself one last party. And to find out if the party actually happens, you might have to read the book.
Wonderful. So tell us about the chocolate saints. Who are they, what are they, and why are they in your book?
It struck me, it struck me a long time ago that from Jesus to Saint Nicholas, also known as Santa Claus, so many of the saints that we think of as white men with blonde hair and blue eyes, or white women with blonde hair and blue eyes, were not white. They were black or brown, but because they've been represented by artists and writers of the West, they've been whitewashed, so to speak, by history and deracinated and made into people they never were. So I made a list of those saints, and it's a very long list. Some of them are in this book. There are many more. And the chocolate saints that are referred to in this book are a mix of historical figures and made-up figures. So there are characters in this book who are seen as chocolate saints, and there are historical figures who also have poems written about them. So Saint Maurice, for example, who a famous saint, always depicted as a white man, was as dark as they come. Saint Nicholas, Santa Claus, was born in Turkey. Jesus was a man who was born in Palestine, was never blonde or blue-eyed, but even in our churches, in the churches of Goa, you'll see Jesus depicted as a blonde, blue-eyed white man. And it's for me, this was a way of reclaiming figures who had been stolen by the West.
I want to stick with that idea of the saints. You have as your epigraph, you use as an epigraph something by Eric Gill. I had to Google him and found out he's a highly controversial character.
Bad man.
Yeah, very bad man. But you use something he said, "What is the mark that distinguishes the good from the bad in works as in men? Holiness is the only word for it." I want to ask you about this idea of spirituality and holiness, because in your book, you often equate the lives of poets as saints, the idea of the self-denying artist as a saint. You even have a bit where Indians, because of our inbuilt spiritual gene, somehow saints. And yet, the book can also be read as a catalog of really unholy things. So I want to ask you, it's a personal question. What does spirituality mean to you, and holiness, and where does India and the poets fit into it?
This might take the rest of the hour. It was very interesting to me that Eric Gill would say something like that. And what he said is that there's one way to distinguish good from bad, whether it's in art or whether it's among humans. And that one quality that distinguishes good from bad is holiness. Coming from Eric Gill, this is...
You might have to tell people a little bit about Eric Gill.
Well, let's put it this way. If Eric Gill were living today, he would be a huge target of the Me Too and Time's Up movement. There would be newspapers saying that all his work should be taken out of the museums. He would be considered the kind of person no young or old, in fact, viewer should ever be exposed to, because he was morally so corrupt. Which brings us to the question, is a bad man, a morally corrupt man, not allowed to show his work to us morally upright people, right? In which case, we shouldn't be looking at Picasso, Caravaggio. I mean, there's, an endless list of artists who just wouldn't be allowed. So, and then it also occurs to me that the saints, for example, Saint Augustine, another chocolate saint, when his famous prayer to God is, "O Lord, make me chaste, but not today." So this is somebody who understood how dangerous and seductive desire can be, how destructive it can be in terms of a whole life or a family's life. And so it struck me that the people who know about disaster, about unholiness, and about holiness are the ones who have suffered and who have been on the other side. So to be a saint, I think it helps to be a sinner. And in that sense, Indian spirituality is far more advanced than Western spirituality. It has more nuance to it. Our saints aren't these, pristine figures who we expect to live chaste, celibate lives. We give them feet of clay. We appreciate that, and we still are able to distinguish and recognize the things they say and separate the wisdom in what they say from their messed up lives, their messed up human lives.
There is a question as well about the life of an artist. And so, of course, coming back to Newton, who is also hardly a saint in the book, you kind of, I want you to read, so I want to ask you about suicide, uplifting topic for the afternoon. But there is a large part of the book that is devoted to the myth of the poet's suicide. And it's a spectacular passage when Goody Law, who is Newton's muse, starts to tell about it. Would you read from that?
The character Newton is compiling a list of suicide saints, or a list of artists and writers and historical figures that he calls suicide saints. And he compiles a very long list, and he's talking about, he's not actually reading the list, but he's talking about who he would put in the list. I'll just read some of it. He opened the book and said the list would begin at the beginning with the book, because nowhere does the Bible condemn self-murder. How could it, when martyrdom was an early variant of suicide? And if suicide was a religious act, then suicides were the unacknowledged saints of the universe. Beginning with Samson under the pillars, or Saul taking to his sword, his name cursed for all time, like Saint Judas, the second most famous biblical suicide. Or Jesus himself, whose death was a pact the Son made with the Father. Jesus and all his apostles, self-made suicides to a man. He said he would begin with the poets. Excuse me. He said he would begin with the poets and proceed not chronologically but sideways, starting with the earlier Romans such as Lucretius and Lucan and Libanius. Joseph, who answered to the name of Pista because after consultation with the neighbors, his foster parents decided that the name Attila did not exist. Mayakovsky, the gambler, partial to Russian roulette, failed prophet whose gunshot was heard around the world. Sergei Yesenin's blood-written goodbye, his patent leather shoes, and the handheld noose like a scarf around his neck because there was nothing new in dying or in living. And Marina, unable to work, penniless from slaving on the hard ship, her husband and daughter taken, abandoned by her lovers, and begging in advance for her son's forgiveness. The pharmacist, George Truckle, whose sweet secret was color, the white sleep, the silver hand, the silver scent of daffodils, the red body of the fish, the red poppy, the red wolf, the purple clouds, the purple grape, the green silence, the green flower, the black rain, the blue grief, the soft blue footsteps of those who had risen from the dead. Gerard de Nerval, who told his aunt, "This life is a hovel, don't wait up," and hanged himself with an apron string. Ronaldo Arenas, sick in New York City, and his note, "Cuba will be free as I already am." Anna Christina Cesar, harnessing the evil of writing to confront desire, who gave in on a London street, and Ceylon deep in the Seine, free to be Ansel again, and the outlaw poet Johnny Ringo, his boots tied to the saddle and horse run off, feet wrapped in his undershirt, dead in the fork of a tree from a gunshot to the head. Rachel Lindsay and Sarah Teasdale, happy in the wide starlight because the dead are free, if only for a single hour. Sylvia, classic head on a kitchen towel in the oven. Asia, acolyte of Sylvia, also by gas. Anne Sexton in furs, sipping a martini in the garage. John Berryman off a bridge into the frozen Mississippi, whose last lines were, I didn't sharpen the Spanish blade. Randall Jarrell's dark overcoat stepping into nighttime highway traffic. Lew Welsh disappeared into the wilderness. Hart Crane disappeared into the sea. Weldon Keys disappeared. Virginia, bombed from 2 homes, left on the banks of the River Ouse, her hat and cane and a letter to Leonard. Everything has gone from me but the certainty of your goodness. Malcolm Lowry, buried and ripe, dead by misadventure or alcohol and barbiturates, rich man's son who never recovered from early happiness, author of impossible instructions to himself. Describe sunlight. Richard Brautigan and Freddie Prinze and Leslie Chong, who stepped from the Mandarin Hotel in Central, 24 floors to the street below. And the actresses of the Indian South, Silk Smitha, who took the poor woman's recourse and won dupatta to ceiling fan. Lakshmi Shri and Nafisa Joseph, also Monal, also Shobha, all of 17. Fatafat Jayalakshmi's sleeping pills, Pratyusha's juice and poison in a parked car, Divya Bharati fooling on the ledge under her window, and my old friend and collaborator, the poet Narayan Das, dead drunk and dead on platform 2 of Churchgate Station. And if the cause of death was a heart attack, the true cause was suicide by alcohol, the Bombay poet's recourse. And the list would end as it began, with a Roman poet, say Cesar Pavese, on a hotel bed, writing, okay, don't gossip too much. Because he knew that gossip would become part of his myth, the poet's suicide myth, which, as we know, is the most powerful of all suicide myths. Thank you very much.
You know, as a poet, it's a little distressing to think that this is the lineage we come from. But I want to ask you a question about happiness and art, because you do create this binary in the book, and you've also referred to it in earlier work in poems, that it's in fact not possible to inhabit the zones of happiness and writing. And why happiness? Let's just settle for stability. You know, happiness is maybe too much. But is it so? Do you believe that?
In a very early poem that I looked at while making the collected poems, putting all my poems together, I came across the line and I'd completely forgotten it, and I must have written it in my 20s. I came across the line, do you want to be happy or do you want to write? And you know, it also reminded me of something else that I thought of in relation to Baudelaire, the poet who, you know, in terms of unhappy lives, I think his might be the standard none of us want to reach, you know. And that is, what comes first, the word or the flesh? What comes first, the decision or the idea that that the creation of art is important enough to sacrifice everything, or the actual moment when you let yourself be reckless or dangerous or just inattentive even. I don't know.
I'll come back to that later. I want to talk about the women in the book. There are some wonderful characters, from the mother, Newton's mother, Beryl, and Goody Law, his muse, and Lula. It felt to me that, you know, these were some of the strongest sections of the book, reading these women, because it's a very delicate balance, because they're also slightly unhinged. I mean, his mother comes at him with a knife when he's a small child, and she's insane, certifiably. And how did you go about writing these characters to give them that roundness, that empathy, without it being ever sentimental or, you know, I don't know. It's just there's a rightness about it.
The thing is, Beryl, of course, is unhinged, and but madness and derangement is something many characters in this book share, men and women. And you know, I've been in rehab. I've been in kind of clinical situations where I've spent a lot of intimate time with people who would be considered deranged. And for some reason, I've always gotten along with them, and they've always gotten along with me. They seem to like me, even gravitate towards me for whatever reason. I mean, it might be because, you know, coming from where I come from, I make really no judgment about, or certainly no moral judgment about disability in any way. So I really often, when I was writing the character of Beryl, and a lot of it is said from her, is said in her voice. It's a first-person account. I didn't think of her as deranged, you know. And it's only later when I hear you say that that I understand. Yeah, of course she's been committed. She was in an asylum, but I mean, if you think about it, there's an absolute logic in her thinking. Nothing is really bizarre, except for maybe one or two things. Like, for example, at one point she's she's talking to somebody and she's talking about the asylum, and then suddenly she talks about Audrey Hepburn out of nowhere. That is a kind of there's no segue there. It's completely from the middle of nowhere. But otherwise, there's a very clear, linear logic and thinking in the way that she speaks. It's just that some things, sometimes she's driven to action that somebody sane would not consider. So I think the thing is, when you think about extreme characters as really not so extreme, as something any of us could be driven to, it immediately makes you see them with a kind of a sympathy, and no, in fact, with a kind of an empathy that will give you the correct attitude, or even the resources or the right to write in their voice.
There is a line by the poet Narayan Das, and he says, "None of our books are in print. This is what it means to be an Indian poet," something like that, which is quite sad and wry and true in a way, because I think we are both Indian poets and we both have out-of-print books, right? My first book is not in print. And is that the reason why you don't write poetry anymore?
Is that the one that was published by ARC?
Yes,
ARC?
that's the one.
Yeah, well, anyway, that's a whole other story there, and we won't go into that. No, that isn't why I don't write anymore. And by the way, that line was told to me by Adil Jasawala. He may not have put it in those words exactly, but he said, when I mentioned to him once that, you know, at that point, in fact, all my books were out of print, he was so unsurprised. And he said, "Why would you even remark on this? Well, what is it even something to mention? You know, this is what it means to be an Indian poet." And he was not being angry or bitter. He was just being absolutely matter-of-fact about the fact that unlike in many countries of the world, in India, to be a poet in English is really to invite a kind of obscurity and a kind of difficulty. And if you aren't, and of course all poets are into difficulty, otherwise they wouldn't be writing poems in the first place. But if you aren't genuinely kind of attracted by difficulty, I don't think you would go anywhere near poetry as an Indian poet.
I think we've been talking about so many things like aging and addiction and suicide and difficulty and suffering, but I just want to reassure you that this is a really entertaining book on many levels, and it is about the life of an artist and what it might mean to be an artist, but it's really I don't know, you have to read it. I was telling Jeet earlier that it's an experience that envelops you as a reader, and it does not bring you down. It takes you into a universe, and I think for someone who is not a practicing artist, it must be a fascinating place to go. I'm going to open this up for questions, but I have one more. I would like to read a very small passage and ask Jeet to respond to that. I'm an old man, and I'm entitled to my peeves. The writers of today are as conservative as novelists or bankers. Terminal affability, addiction to approval. What will auntie think? What will the neighbors think? This is the neurosis of the middle-class Indian. But for a moment there, we cared less about the relatives and the neighbors. We were devotees of anarchy and marijuana. We made our rhymes to a soundtrack of R.D. Burman, Waterfront, Gee Whiz, Human Bondage, Synthetic Frost, Savage Encounter, The Voodoos, The People, Tryst, Bharat Mata Naach Kud Baja, Cosmic Junk, and the mother mushroom of 100 psychedelic Indias, Atomic Forest. Why has no one made a movie about that time, or a play or book? We live in the moment. We have no talent for history, and we are unable to adapt to modernity. This is the true reason. And I'll tell you one last thing. If a nation does not care for its past, it does not care for its future. And if it does not care for its poets, it does not care for anything at all. Great passage. And also...
Great reading, thank you.
Just a quick, can you say, because to me this was also a book about India, because you cover so much time. And you know, when you are talking about the Bombay poets, for those of us who weren't there, but who have heard about it as a kind of mythical time, when there was a place called Bombay where the poets did their weird sitting in their places and didn't have books in print, but were nevertheless poets. And to the India that is now, I want you to just say a little bit about that.
You know, I mean, when I worked on this book, and when I think of it now and talk about it now, it does seem like a mythical, magical, you know, hugely productive time. But at the time, when we were caught in that, it was anything but, as Arsha would agree, I think. In fact, it was desolating. It was absolutely negative. There was not, you know, there was no internet. There were no readings. There was nothing like this. There were no literary festivals. If you did a poetry reading, if the best poets in the country, 6 of the best poets in the country got together to read, there would be 8 people in the audience. I went to a A.K. Ramanujan reading in 90 or 91, something like, or maybe a bit earlier. There were 16 people in the audience, you know. And for us, 16 was excellent. We were thrilled to see 16 people. That was huge, you know. And we weren't aware of our own degradation. That's what it was. Because we thought this is how it is, you know. And you can't expect any better. And for some weird reason, you did it anyway, you know.
Questions, please. We have 10 minutes.
I was actually reading William Styron's Darkness Visible, and he had actually paraphrased one of Pavez's final lines, and he said, "No more words and act, I'll never write again." So when you were just, sort of giving this reading, I was just thinking, because this is sort of a declaration of this finality of artistry, right? Like, he's not going to write again. Is that something that you ever thought about while writing this book? Like how, this myth of suicide is not just sort of killing yourself, but sort of stopping yourself in terms of, artistic output, and, how it affects your characters and the poets in your book as well. So.
Thanks for that. I think it can be a very useful thing to think of a poem or a novel, or in fact whatever it is you might be working on, as the last thing you're ever going to do. And it did occur to me several times, because I am of an advanced age, that this might be the last big book that I write, that I might not write very many more books to follow, and in fact, I might write nothing. And I think it's very useful to think like that, even if it's just a poem that you're working on, to think that this might be the last poem that you ever write, because you bring everything into it. And it becomes a matter of life and death. And you can see that in the work of certain poets. Szymborska, Wisława Szymborska, you really feel when you read her that each one, she writes it as if this is it. She's never writing another poem again, Sylvia Plath has that sense, So many poets have that this is it, all or nothing, take no prisoners kind of, sensibility that you can read in between the lines and in between the words. And I think it's a hugely useful technical tool for a writer.
In today's writing, how do you feel the writing about the past and writing history? Would you differentiate both? How is it in present writing?
Well, any kind of writing is really writing about the past, right? Because you're sitting at a desk, or wherever you might be sitting, with pen to paper or with a laptop open, and you're writing about something, even if it happened that morning, it's something that happened in the past, and what you're bringing to it is the lens of some kind of nostalgic feeling about something that occurred, or some kind of distanced feeling about a moment in time. I don't think I really differentiate very much between the recent past and the distant past. History, the now is history. This moment is history.
How do you think poetry fits into this reawakening?
I don't know if it does fit.
Sir, I've not read your book, but actually there is a writer who kept on writing about artists who are very, very famous. Same writer, I know who it is. That is, one is Lust for Life, the other one is I, Michelangelo, the sculptor. The other one is Passion for Mind. I think he's an American writer. He wrote the same things which you're trying to say in a very, very, very larger way. Would you like to do something like that, which this author has left some of the greatest artists who are not recognized but who are very great, like Van Gogh, or he wrote about everybody, Sigmund Freud, and Michelangelo, and Van Gogh, and everybody. This is in your style, but in a very, very, very large scale. I forgot the name of the author. He's the same author.
Thank you for the question.
Well, all I can say is I don't know if greatness is a fitting subject for somebody as small as me.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about what Roberto Bolaño has meant to you artistically, particularly in the writing of this novel? His presence is very clear.
I took something from Bolaño in this novel, and that is that oral history technique. But then, he stole that from the author that he stole it from. Literary theft, as opposed to literary borrowing, theft is far better, as T.S. Eliot told us. The good writers steal, they don't borrow. Literary theft is a tradition with tremendous literary authority, and it is the correct thing to do. If I were to actually put down a list of authors that I read or that affected the writing of this book, it would go back to the poets I read when I was 12 or 13. You know, that's it. The anxiety of influence, I think, is never ending, and it's, I think, an enormous part of the writer's process. Every poem, every story is really written as a response to something you've read, something in the past, and it's an absolutely honorable tradition.
Okay, and on that note, I think we have to end. So thank you to Jeet.
Thank you to Tishani.
Wonderful. I think he'll be signing books. Yeah, please do read the book of Chocolate Saints.
Thanks so much. Thank you.